it's my pleasure to introduce the next panel. Please join me in welcoming Kristi Mansfield from Seer Data and Analytics, who will very briefly introduce us to the speakers. It's all yours.
We only have 30 minutes, so we're going to get straight into it. And I'm sure all of you do know Professor Gernot Heiser, who's the Scientia Professor and John Lyons Chair at UNSW. I'm trying to be rushed, but I can't. Daniella Traino, Group Chief Information Security Officer at Westfarmers, and Alisdair Faulkner, CEO and co-founder of Darwinium. Can I ask you, please, Gernot, to please start us off, 4 minutes of why this is important, the need for critical digital infrastructure to protect our organisations and our country.
What hasn't been talked much about is the skeletons in the closet. And actually, that's an understatement. There's no closet big enough to hide all the skeletons. And what I'm referring to is that our computer systems, which are all around us and are such an integral part of our lives, are fundamentally unfit for purpose in the sense that they are unreliable, insecure. And so we're building castles on sand. And a lot of the work that's happening in security, resilience, etc., is patching, putting band-aids over holes. It's treating symptoms as opposed to addressing the underlying causes. And to a degree, I can't blame industry because they have to work with what they're given, so they are given something with lots of holes and they have to find a heap of band-aids to try to patch them up. But it's not an excuse for the research side. A lot of the research is also solving yesterday's problems and treating symptoms. And we really need to get back on working on the fundamental issues that are plaguing these systems. Why is this important? Well, if you drive a car, then you're not in control of the car. You might think you are. What you're doing, if the car is a halfway recent model, is you're giving input to a computer and the computer controls the car. It doesn't even have to be an autonomous car. And just to give you some example of the possible implications, all of us Sydney-siders, we know when there's an accident on the Harbour Bridge, and one lane is closed, you feel it throughout the whole inner city. It doesn't take a lot of imagination if, say, a unfriendly nation states, and there's plenty who have the capability, could just hijack a few cars on the roads, it doesn't take many, produce 10 strategically placed accidents, not even killing anyone, and the city would grind to standstill. And there's other things like, for example, the US Department of Homeland Security a few years ago has shown that by breaking into the control system of a power generator, you can literally blow it up. So this is the reality we're facing, and we really have to put significant efforts in actually solving this, and not solving it by putting band-aids on, but by fixing the underlying technology. And just for a bit of self-advertising, this is what we and our group have been doing for the past 20 years. We have built the world's first operating system with a correctness proof. It's called SEO4. It's being deployed in real in defense systems in real use. It's getting into medical devices. It's getting into space if it's not there, and it's very heavily getting into electric and autonomous cars. But that's just the beginning. So my main message here is all is not well, and we need to put some real effort into making it well, and it requires really starting at the bottom and building up actually secure technology. The present technology is mostly inherently unsuitable and unfixable.
Thank you. Daniella.
At the risk of sounding very depressing off the back of that, I think there is definitely a fragility in our critical infrastructure. I think what I've seen in Australia, and although it's a global phenomenon, but mostly in Australia, is the fundamental misunderstanding that critical infrastructure includes our research and education sector. So we cannot be a knowledge economy, we cannot have the innovations and all the things that we've talked about this morning without also protecting the very vital institutions that help us get there. So unfortunately, although the government in Australia has put out critical infrastructure protection bills with an acknowledgement to some degree about our future resilience, they haven't quite hit on the definition and hadn't expanded it to that. And yet we fundamentally look at intellectual property and what we develop in this country and others as vital for our future. But there is a fragility in that, and I always wonder if we didn't have the Australian attitude of safety, and she'll be right, whether if we were Ukraine right now, we would have a very different approach over the last couple of years. So what we're seeing across globally, and it's playing out in Australia in smaller microcosms, is that there's definitely a fragility in the systems that we rely on, not to the extent necessarily that you could effectively create a Chernobyl, but there is the fragility, and if we're using critical infrastructure and we consider them critical to our livelihood, whether it's water, as Feng had mentioned earlier, whether it's the electricity that we rely on or the information highway that powers us, I think we need to take a really good hard look of how we're basing that trust, how we're basing the ability of that to be available. We've seen that play out in other economies, smaller in sense in Australia. If you think about these things have always existed, but now we're using technology and we're embedding that into our life more closely. So things where there's always been political interference or disinformation in the past is now at scale, at a pace where I always ask the question, do you really know you're a dog on the internet? And the more and more that we rely on technology, which has massive benefits, as the other panelists have said, the more we need to question the basis of our trust in those systems, and do we actually have the solutions in place to help us understand where we can place our trust and where we can't. And so there are many solutions that industry, Westfarmers and many others rely on, and we have over 1,400 cybersecurity vendors, or vendors that associate their products as providing trust, security, privacy, but they are very much looking at symptoms of the problem. And so I think there's definitely an exciting opportunity when we think about our future resilience of really changing the way in which we build trust and the way in which we rely on trust. Because as humans, how we determine what we can trust is becoming really, really difficult. And we saw that play out with some of the political challenges in actually the UK with the Brexit, and we saw that also with the US elections. What we're seeing also is that some systems which were not traditionally, well, they were traditionally built with a very on-premise, physical, perimeter-based security model, where you would have your electricity substation, sort of behind barbed wires. That is fine, but it doesn't translate the same trust model, the same resiliency when you start to digitize that. And there are massive benefits in digitizing these industries, but have we built sufficient resilience? And particularly when most of those who are likely to test out your resilience, and we've seen this to date play out, and Ukraine is right now experiencing this at scale and has been for many months, actually years if you go back to NotPetya. We haven't scaled our solutions. And so the challenge that we have when we talk about future resilience is, are we looking at critical infrastructure definitions correctly? Are we really focusing on those critical services, critical industries? And the second is, are we supporting the innovators, the research community and others? Because I think there's a partnership that's missed opportunity where we're leaving too much value on the table and we haven't come together well enough here. But certainly there's an opportunity if we sponsor those sorts of things and think with a long-term lens, then maybe the future is brighter than what it looks like now, because there's always going to be that nefarious undercurrent of community. Crime has always existed. The black markets have always existed. They innovate just as fast as we do, but unfortunately, they collaborate better than what we do as an industry and a research group, despite the fact that they don't have the trust framework that we could do. But they still managed to find it. So I'll get off my little spiel.
Thanks, Daniella.
No, I think Daniella hit the nail on the head in terms of, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, and I think that was actually just exemplified in terms of the Australian government saying, on the back of providing sanctions on Russia to be aware of cyber attacks. And then if you look at some of the precautions, the top ones are really protecting humans and your human access system. So phishing attacks, credential attacks where people have taken something stolen on the internet and try and use that against you. And so I've always been fascinated with this problem. So prior to Darwinium, I co-founded a company called Threatmetrics. And, essentially it was probably the world's largest and leading fraud detection company. So it protects over 1 billion accounts. 1 in every $3 spent online comes from technology that was actually created out of Chatswood originally and is still there. So still a significant R&D there. But anyhow, I come from that lens. And when we first started Threatmetrics, the problem was that someone could use an IP address to pretend a proxy. Typically, it was a compromised computer on someone's network where you could pretend to be anyone from anywhere at any time using someone else's identity. The problem now that we're facing, and we're facing this into the next decade, is that with automation and AI applied to attacking defenses, that means you're going to be defending against all people from all places at all times, or at least your systems are going to be under that threat. So denial of service attacks and those sorts of things really are just the beginning. Denial of service attacks really are directed at your infrastructure to make them unavailable. Now, what happens if your actual systems are getting what they think is valid payment transactions, what they think is getting valid new customers, what they think is getting valid access attempts? How do you operate in that environment? And I tell you, it is happening, and it's going to just continue to increase. So when I think about resilience, take the NIST definition where you say, look, first of all, you need to be able to anticipate the problem, then you need to be able to withstand the problem, you need to be able to recover from the problem, and then you need to be able to adapt to the problem. So anticipation is understanding things like, we know that the human, as we get better at solving our critical infrastructure problems, then the human always becomes the element, or the systems that are meant to allow humans in become the area of attack. Now, if we anticipate AI, and we're already seeing deep learning, people being able to fabricate faces, videos, voice, what do you think that can do to social engineering attacks? Right now, scam attacks have outpaced fraud attacks. Like in the UK, it's 85% of all fraud losses, or all losses to the bank, are actually from convincing somebody to do something against their own best interests. Now, how do you do that when that's applied to scale, and it's your mother, and it's her voice on that phone, and you can FaceTime them, they look exactly like that? We're just clearly not prepared for that. That's a small-scale example. Now imagine that just magnified to be every CEO, every person who's put anything public, and that you could be anyone from anywhere at all time, all the time. So that's one of the things I get out of bed and worry about, strangely enough. Obviously a very sick human. So that's anticipating the attacks, then withstanding the attacks. So I think for us, one of the greatest thing that China's ever invented was the Great Firewall, right? The best trade barrier, the best resilience engine, actually probably one of the best weapons, actually, if you talk like at a digital sense, in terms of being able to do reflective attacks to take down infrastructure. We've looked at Russia and others as countries that have looked at how do they make their payment systems resilient, how can they withstand if they're taken off, and if they've shut their internet down, how do they operate as an island, an internet island? Are we able to do the same? Probably not at this point in time. But when you think about that kind of problem, that scale, if you anticipate that we're going to be on a cold, hot war as an ongoing challenge, as things are becoming more automated and we have less kinetic wars, which are harder to sustain, then we need to have a national effort that's able to understand what are those packets that are coming in and out of our networks, what's exactly going on, what are the intent of that packets, and it has to be at millions and billions of packets per second. And we have to do that in a way that preserves privacy. Then if you look at things like how is your ability to recover from, withstand, that's one point. How do you look at your ability to recover? Things like chaos engineering, being able to anticipate that something's going to go wrong. Actually, Netflix had this thing called Chaos Monkey, which is a script that randomly shuts off bits of its infrastructure, its applications, to see whether it can continue to run. One of my unfortunate experiences at Threatmetrics is we did not have that. Our systems ran so well because we powered a lot of commerce and transactions, except for the one time when we were all out on a boat, critical people out on a boat, one of our carrier switches went down, and our customer, who happened to be a very large retailer, you would know, that a global brand, one of the largest top 5, let's say, we were bad, but they didn't put in a timeout that says if the API doesn't respond, then we let it go. And so the CEO calls down and goes, apparently what we were doing was blocking 6,000 transactions a minute or something like that because we weren't, they weren't anti-fragile, and there's only a few times where you get the, notoriety of a CEO that goes, get that SHHH, star explicit thing off my site. So you want to be anti-fragile as a lesson from that, but then you need to adapt. And so, part of the vision for Darwin, this is not a plug for us, it's going to take us 10, 20 years, it's not a near future thing, but it's a great academic or a great research topic is, how do you build for the next cyber defense company, how you'd build that from the ground up is that you'd build the attacker along with the defense. And then you'd make those two things attack each other. And so that's what we're applying. That's the end goal of Darwinium, is to be able to apply AI to not only the defense, but also build the attack so you can simulate customers' attacks and then have computers try and come up with random types of attacks. So I think that's the future of information and cyber warfare and resilience. And that was way over 4 minutes. But sorry, I tried to speak fast.
Did you get all that? So we've discussed resilience deficit, Daniella. We've discussed the trust deficit. We've discussed point solutions and looking at, how what some of the adaptation solutions might be. And you laid out a future vision there for how we might handle this as a collaborative partnership effort. Alisdair, is part of the problem that we're defending against yesterday's hacks in silos? And is that part of the problem, and what do you see is the opportunity for the industry, the sector, the actors to come together and collaborate to build this future that you're all warning against?
Question for me. There's clearly plenty of opportunities, and some people are taking it seriously and are building systems from the ground up to be secure. At the moment, this is mostly happening in the classical defense space because they are the most paranoid and understand the challenges mostly, and also have the money to really invest in new solutions. But I would say it's starting to trickle through the cyber-physical system space, and of course these are the things where really life are immediately at stake, right? You don't need a kinetic car war if you can drive people into a wall or stop their heart pacemakers, etc. So things are happening, but there needs to be much closer collaboration between research and industry, and I would say, by and large, the awareness of the problem in industry is still pretty low. I see that specifically in the automotive industry, where there's the thinking, the understanding that there's no safety without security has not really arrived at a lot of people there. It's starting to happen, but it's still a slow process. And this is really fundamental. You need to understand that if you have something that can be attacked, it's never going to be safe.
I think just on that, Gernot, it's not just the automotive industry, although with your deep expertise, they certainly are suffering from a knowledge gap and an understanding, but it's also very true for large industrial manufacturing organisations. They don't necessarily have the digital construct and the understanding of, one, the fragility of their systems, and also what digital brings and what the security model has morphed into over time. They are very good around safety. They have an incredibly embedded culture and understanding, but the confluence or convergence of safety and trust, or security more broadly, is not there, and that's not an Australian thing, that's an industry gap. There are things that are changing, but it is incredibly slow. Partly it's a leadership gap. Partly it's also, in some respects, it's a media issue, because the media tends to sensationalize these really out there examples, and for the most part, either it desensitizes a number of executives in thinking, oh, well, we can't do anything, we're going to just be in the melee. And then the others, it's, oh, it won't happen to me, I'm not a bank, or I'm not in X country. So I think we still have a knowledge gap, and that might take a few years or decades before we get new leadership, or we start improving how we share knowledge. I think there are networks that are happening within industry. Certainly, I think there's the opportunity to do better with research, even though with my time in CSIRO and Data 61, I think we did a mammoth effort to try to bridge the gap, but It doesn't happen overnight. I think there is still a long way to go, particularly in Australia, because in other countries it's been largely fueled by their defence and other industries around those partnerships, and now industry's gotten on board. We still have a long way to go in Australia, but I think there is so much talent here. The other thing is, though, the convergence of the disciplines in this room. I think there's an opportunity for the disciplines. I mean, we've heard other speakers today talking about cybernetics and other things. There's the convergence of these disciplines to look at the problem space differently, so we're not getting these point solutions. We're actually looking at some fundamental changes that effectively wipe categories off the market map, because we are still patching and praying. And if we look at even just some of the things we saw with Log4j, which was just the most recent software vulnerability, and previously we saw things that happened with SolarWinds and others. From an industry perspective, it's quite an exhausting process to be in, with only that at your fingertips is to patch or to turn off a service. That's, in a lot of cases, it's debilitating. It's also exhausting for our teams. But there are networks in intelligence and sharing within industry with researchers. It doesn't go far enough because we still have barriers about the extent of information we share, the legal and reputational impacts of saying, I have had X problem, and this is how I had to solve it, or this is what it cost me. I think we still got some of that stigma to go through.
Daniella, did you want to add anything to that? Okay.
That was brilliant.
So, thank you. And so you're calling for different ways to move forward to address some of this. In the last couple of minutes, could we just drive into what those consequences are that citizens may have to bear if we don't work together, collaborate, and address this? Because you've rightly outlined, Daniella, there's different levels of maturity across lots of different industries in this space, across our entire economy and society. What are the impacts and consequences we as citizens will have to bear if this doesn't happen?
I'll keep this one short so my colleagues can chat through, but I guess I'm the cynical one, and I'll say that I don't think the citizens truly appreciate or have the knowledge to understand the implications of some of the things we've talked about and the consequences, because in cyber, those consequences are not immediate, they're not necessarily tangible, they can take years to play out, and by that stage, the impacted individual or citizen may not have connected how that came to be. And I'll give you just a really, really simple, bland example. Service New South Wales had a couple of 100,000 records that was part of a data breach. The root cause was a number of poor practices, information handling, including the security of that information. But there were hundreds of thousands of very, very sensitive information about our citizens, which you could effectively, if you had access to, recreate the identity and of individuals, and you could use it for a whole manner of things. True criminals don't use that information immediately. They weaponize it over time, and they use it in various different ways. As a citizen, I saw the breach, but do I feel the implications? No. I don't actually get anything but credit monitoring, which is a maybe, and it's a great service, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to feel the impact until maybe my kids or someone else in the future. The cynic in me.
Would you be willing to contribute to that?
I can just fully agree with what Daniella has been saying. She's speaking my words.
So we don't understand the long-term implications of not enough action, collaboration now.
No, but I mean, the more direct ones are where you see they cut off the electricity, or in Maroochydore many years ago, they redirected the sewer into the clean waters. I mean, there are physical implications, but largely when it's information warfare, they take quite a while, other than the fraud side.
Well, no, actually, a perfect example about fraud. It would frustrate the hell out of me is that there'd be a data breach, and then it would often be the people who were holding the customer's data in the first place, like the credit bureaus, and that their only solution was to give you a product for free that they were selling, which is based on your data in the first place. And in fact, it didn't really solve the problem. It was you needed to be able to, what you needed to be able to do was to have an industry that would update the locks. So, the equivalent of the keys are now everywhere, and actually there needed to be an industry action to say, now that we know all of this identity data is out there, our systems need to be able to make sure that they're are able to understand this threat. The thing that really scares the willies out of me, to be honest, is our medical data, which is the perfect canonical example from Daniella, right? I am absolutely scared silly. I do not believe at all that we have the ability to keep medical data currently safe the way it is. I don't care, as secure, and this is not a slight at anybody who's in that industry, who's not doing their best to try and secure it, but that medical data, what I didn't appreciate until I got into fraud was, if you look at politics and other sorts of things, is you think often things are done by coercion, like money. Money and some profit motive. But actually what you don't realize is that probably 90 or 80% of, criminal behavior relies on coercion, which is I know something about you that I can get you to do something I want based on that knowledge of you. Right? That's actually how the majority of the criminal networks work. It's like bribing's one part of it, but that's actually a way more effective way because you can get people in power to do things that they shouldn't do. So that's one of the things I think that people don't appreciate with medical. Like there's so much good use to having medical data secured, but if it's anything like our credit data being secured, it's not going to be very secure for long.
I think the other side of it is, we shouldn't forget that there are humans who are impacted by some of these events and the decisions we make either to secure or not secure critical infrastructure, whether it's their identity data, whether it's their usage of electricity or their browsing habits on Netflix. It's all about profiling as much for that purpose that Alisdair mentioned. But if you talk to anybody that actually has been through an identity fraud or has gone through the process of being impacted and it wasn't an activity that they were involved in directly, they feel violated. They are visibly and emotionally shaken when they go through that. And yet we have so much richness from the use of this technology and the innovations that this community is bringing forth. But if we don't also think about the humans and their impact from when these things go wrong, whether it's physically or biologically or otherwise, then there's unintended consequences, and what kind of a society are we creating? I think the perfect example is when they brought out with Alexa. I had one of the researchers said that they put it in the house, the son, and that was using it to order takeaway, and they were getting pretty lazy. They didn't want to use the phone, so they would bark orders at Alexa to order pizza. And the way that barking happened to Alexa was so demeaning, so antagonistic and almost subservient that in the moment it didn't make sense, but over time it's breaking some of our social niceties or norms, what we think are norms. So I go back to some of our earlier speakers and saying, we are actually got to build trust and got to think about these other consequences in the critical infrastructure, but in everything that we build, because there is absolutely a value system that we are creating in these systems. It just may not be with the intended consequences we think.
Thanks, you were spot on. Just one minor comment following up on this is there's a big market failure. There's solutions out there. We can start fixing the problem from the ground up. It will cost money. That money has to be invested. But the market is against it because it's much cheaper on the balance sheet to not do anything. So the one part of the solution has to be to put the damage on the balance sheets. So the companies who lose our data or otherwise behave irresponsible, do not apply best practice, are actually punished at the stock market. Until that happens, we will keep on fighting the losing arms race.
Thank you. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to put on the table, I think the Australian data strategy outlines, the vision for data infrastructure in our country and significant investments around a number of different initiatives. That include, of course, the data sharing between government agencies and researchers for improvement in societal services and economic benefit. And so there is investment and there is a pathway for using data for the future of Australia. What is missing then from that, and what would you be calling for from this room to take action on? Because there's consultation open right now with Prime Minister and Cabinet. What would you call for people in this room to do, given that there's a clear pathway that we see now data as an asset for this country?
I think I just made my pitch, so I pass.
Invest in trustworthy systems. I think this is where this community needs a stronger voice, because I think you are the voice of reason in some respects and unreason, depending on where you want to push the technology. I think this community can see the benefits, but also can see where some of the safeguards or the questions need to be raised. Industry is very much focused on the stakeholder, the economic value, because that is what they're set up for. But we need a balance in the data strategy. I think there's massive opportunities it wants to realise around data sharing. We can unlock so many services and capabilities, get it. But where is the voice of this community? One, to make sure we have the safeguards and the thinking around building that trust and resilience in what we're doing, so that we are not, just because we can do something doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? And so the use of the data starts off with the premise, but are we changing and blurring the lines? And we saw that with COVID, the government and others took the initiative to start the sharing of data, but then we saw QR codes that weren't secure, and now they're out in the free market. Who knows what you could do with that information if you were inclined. It's not to say that we shouldn't be rushing towards innovation. I think we should also be asking these other questions to make sure we create the brakes to accelerate the Ferrari that is the data evolution.
Nice one. Just a few quick comments. One, they could be crazy ideas, but I've got a lot of them. But one of them is providing the right incentives. So things like liability shifts. So that's important for businesses. So being able to share data in a way that shields them from liability. The counterterrorism laws in the US enable that for banks, which is very helpful, or it's been more helpful. I think the investment of researchers into privacy-preserving computing, or PET technologies, is essential. I think actually what might be an interesting out-of-the-box idea is we have R&D tax grants, which has been really a very effective way for Australian companies to compete on the global scale. If there was such a scheme for updating your security systems, i.e., that there was a tax rebate for investment in your cyber resilience, which means, it's like the weakest link. And in a sense, it makes our entire society more resilient if there is a certain level of investment in security, and I think those sorts of the right incentives. And then you had, obviously, like GDPR has probably been the most successful implementation of a uniform privacy standard with all of its faults, precisely because they had punitive measures on revenue, percentage of revenue and others. And so that actually was big enough for people to take notice. So those were just 3 ideas.
Thank you. So I have the wind up, but I feel like we could stay and talk for a lot longer. Please make sure you catch up with the panel at lunch. Thank you so much. I just want to call to action. It's up to us to engineer the brakes for the Ferrari that is the future of the data age. Thanks, everybody. Great.